All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, my APUSH boys and girls, to another episode here. We have chapter 15 today. So, chapter 15, halfway through our content here of the year, we have Reconstruction. We have been really building up to the Civil War for a while now, and now it's finally over. Well, now we have to get past it, okay? We have to rebuild the country and bring ourselves back together. There are a few questions that we must answer in Reconstruction in order for it to be successful. And number one is, how do we bring the South back into the Union, right? How do we reunify and bring this South back into the Union? Although Lincoln never acknowledged that they seceded or left, they did ultimately, right? They left. They were the Confederacy. Well, now we have to bring them back in. Number two, how do we rebuild physically the South after the war is over, right? The majority of the war is fought in the South, and so we must rebuild the South, okay, hence the name Reconstruction. Number three, how do we integrate and protect this newly emancipated black freedmen group? Think about it, they weren't allowed to be literate and they didn't have jobs, they didn't have money, they didn't have education, so there's a lot of questions to answer there, what to do with this group. And four, this is a big one that I'm really going to try to harp on, and that is what branch of the government has control of Reconstruction. Okay, we're going to find out which branch has control and how they relinquish control to another branch. So we'll tune back into that in a little bit. One of the first things we need to know is, as the Civil War is coming to an end, the federal government, while Lincoln's still alive, they pass what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is one amongst many federal agencies that is created, but this one was supposed to be, their slogan was 40 acres and a mule. They were supposed to provide these former slaves with 40 acres of land and a mule to help cultivate it in order to be successful, earn some money, etc. What the plan originally was to take all of the Confederate land in the South, divide it up, and give it to these newly emancipated slaves. Well, think about how the South would have reacted to such a thing. And so this actually rarely happened. Although 40 acres and a mule was their slogan, this Freedmen's Bureau rarely gave that to them. So not very successful, right? Well, not exactly. Okay, there was one shining example that we do get, one success, if you will, from the Freedmen's Bureau, and that has to do with education. It will set up schools and provide over 200,000 African Americans with education, because remember, they weren't allowed to be literate as slaves. So this economically vulnerable group is making some progress, and in this case, the Freedmen's Bureau, that's education. As we said, the South is going to resent the Freedmen's Bureau, and they're not going to like it. They do believe the federal government's giving them too much assistance, and they're not going to agree with it. However, this assistance was obviously necessary. Now, talking about the federal government and their assistance, let's talk about what the federal government's plan was with Reconstruction. And that brings us to the executive branch, okay? And that means Lincoln. You say, wait, Lincoln, I thought he died. Yes, but it doesn't mean Lincoln didn't have plans to obviously go through with Reconstruction. Obviously, he didn't know he was going to die, and so he had his own plans. So what were his plans? Now, Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction, we're going to call that the 10% plan. He wanted 10% of a state's voters to pledge an oath of allegiance to the Union and also accept emancipation, the 13th Amendment, we're going to say. 10% of a state's voters, think about that for a second, that's not a lot. And so 10% of a state's voters is going to be a very lenient plan. Okay, now you think, why? Why would Lincoln be so lenient on the South? Well, he wants to move past this, okay? He doesn't want to prolong this issue any longer, and he wants to move past the Civil War, doesn't want them to possibly rise up again or continue fighting the Civil War. So let's move past this. Now, Lincoln's opposers, okay, in Congress, they want a much harsher plan, and that's going to be called the Wade-Davis plan, where they were going to require a state's 50% voters in order to take an oath of allegiance. Along with accepting emancipation. This was much harsher, 50% as opposed to 10%, obviously a big difference there. Lincoln is not going to go along with this idea. He's going to pocket veto it. If you remember what a veto is, that's when the president denies a bill. When a president pocket vetoes, it just means they let it sit on their desk and they let it expire, essentially. Okay, they purposely use up as much time as possible to prolong the process. So he never signs it, okay? And we'll talk later on about how or what happens to a bill when it is vetoed. So obviously Lincoln doesn't make it to see Reconstruction. So now the big question is his successor, Andrew Johnson, the president, what is he going to do with it? This is a big issue because Andrew Johnson, he's not a Republican like Lincoln. He's a Democrat. And he's from Tennessee, which makes him more of a Southerner than a Northerner. So this is a big question. So what does Andrew Johnson do? He does recognize Lincoln's 10% plan. However, we are going to see that he's going to start to show his true colors a little bit afterwards as he starts pardoning many former Confederate leaders. And that's not cool. The South is going to basically allow their former, all of their former congressional members, their seats back. And so if you were to walk into Congress in 1865 versus 1863, I'm sorry, 1860 to 1865, you're not going to see too much of a difference. You're going to see a lot of those former faces before the Civil War re-enter politics and take their seats back in Washington. So one of the First Amendments we already mentioned, but the South had to accept upon re-entering the Union after the Civil War was the 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment was the abolition of slavery, okay? No more slavery, all right? And America's, pretty much late to the game as far as, major countries in the world because a lot of European countries had already abolished slavery way before us. But nonetheless, okay, the 13th Amendment is passed in 1865, and Southern states must accept this upon re-entering the Union. Okay, further talking about Southern defiance and what's going on with these freed slaves. We talked about slave codes a couple of weeks ago, in which slave codes were restrictions on slaves. The purpose was to make sure they don't rise up, to make sure that they are reprimanded, or to prevent them from moving up in society. And now that that's over, okay, we're going to see that be replaced by black codes. And the black codes, their purpose is pretty much the same, is to basically guarantee that these newly emancipated people are still in the same socioeconomic status. So an example of a slave code would have been not being allowed to read and write, not being allowed to vote, not being allowed to own land. An example of a black code, okay, not being able to borrow money to buy land, not being able to vote or serve on a jury. And another one was these forced them to sign labor contracts where they had to be forced to work on someone's land because of a contract, and they couldn't break that contract. Now, to me, that doesn't sound like too much has changed there. It sounds like they've just replaced black codes, replaced slave codes with black codes. And again, those examples don't sound too different to me. So again, how much has changed? I don't know. That's obviously up to you to argue. As far as what many slaves do after the war is over, well, think about it. Generalizing, obviously, what is the biggest skill that most of them have? Crops, agriculture, working in a field. And so they don't have many other skills. And so you are going to see a lot of former slaves look to work on land. Problem is, okay, they don't have money to buy their own land, which means they need to work on someone else's. And the person that they work on their land, what they're going to have to do is they don't have the money to pay rent, essentially, to work on that land. They're going to share a portion of the crops that they cultivate with the owner of the land, hence the term sharecroppers. It's kind of like your American version of feudalism, where you don't have money to work to buy your own land, and so you cultivate your own piece of land and share your crops with the lord or the owner of the land, and that's a sharecropper. All right, so again, if I were to tell you this picture on the slide was from slavery, you would believe me. Okay, but it's actually sharecroppers. Again, the question, how much has changed? All right, let's start to talk about the rift between Congress and the president. The president obviously has vowed to take Lincoln's 10% plan. However, we've already seen him start to pardon former Southern congressional leaders, and which means we said they're going to re-enter their politics, their old seats in Washington, which is not good. So what else happens that's going to further this divide between the two branches? Well, in 1866, a year after the Civil War is over, the Freedmen's Bureau is up, and so Congress wants to re-up it. They want to continue it and extend it, and President Johnson vetoes it. Now, him vetoing it doesn't mean the bill is dead. Okay, remember, when a bill is vetoed by the president, the bill can go back down to Congress, and if Congress votes on 2/3 of majority of the bill, they can override the president's veto, and that's exactly what they do. Congress is on a different page than the president, and they override his veto on extending the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the same year, something very similar happens. Okay, the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 is passed by Congress, and they need the president's approval. He says no. He vetoes it. What does the Civil Rights Bill do? It would have granted citizenship to African Americans, okay, and get rid of black codes. Now, this paves the way for the future amendment, the 14th Amendment, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But Johnson says no. He says, I don't want it. Okay, he vetoes it. And the same thing happens again. Congress overrides his veto. That's two bills within the same year that are overridden by Congress. This is the first time in history that we've seen two bills overridden in the same year, nonetheless, by Congress, okay, because of the president's veto. So we haven't seen this before. It's not impossible, but it's very rare, okay? 2/3 of Congress to override a president's veto is very rare, and that requires a lot of votes. Okay. Next, okay, we mentioned the 14th Amendment, okay, was kind of established by the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship to all former slaves, these African Americans. Sorry, Dred Scott, too little, too late. It gives equal protection of law and due process to anybody who is born here in America. They are considered a citizen. They're supposed to be protected by the laws, the same laws that you and I are. And also is supposed to prevent former Confederate officials from retaining their office. Okay, as we've talked about, Johnson kind of pardons a lot of those and gets around it. Now, the 14th Amendment, okay, is passed. That's our second amendment now that we must know from this chapter. Next, the North has to keep an eye on the South. And so after the Civil War is over, we're actually going to leave the troops in the South to really keep an eye on them and to make sure that they are adhering to these new amendments, okay, the 13th, 14th, and later on the 15th Amendments. All right, and this is called the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Okay, we leave the military in the South in order to keep an eye on them to make sure they're not infringing upon or limiting the rights of African Americans. So the time has come where we finally see the divide between the executive branch, Andrew Johnson, and Congress, okay, those radical Republicans. We've talked about how we've seen slowly but surely him be on this separate page than Congress. Well, here's the nail in the coffin to that story. So a newly passed law in 1867 called the Tenure of Office Act, says, okay, the president is not allowed to remove any of the president's cabinet members without congressional approval. Why? This law was purposely passed because they didn't want Lincoln's cabinet members being replaced by Andrew Johnson, and he breaks the rules in 1868 by removing the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. Now, when you break the law as the president, okay, just like you and I, okay, you go to trial, and that's called impeachment. Now, remember, when the president is impeached, it doesn't mean they're removed from office, okay? Impeachment means a trial. In that trial, okay, if they are deemed guilty, okay, if they lose the trial, they are no longer allowed to be president. If they win the trial, okay, then they are still allowed to be president, okay? Now, President Johnson goes on trial, he is impeached, and he falls one vote shy of being impeached, which means they allow him to be president for the remainder of his term. Problem is, it's really the end of his political career. He's got months left of the presidency, and in 1868 is an election year. President Johnson is not going to, his political career is over. He's not going to be able to run on his own ticket and win. So he's done, okay? The impeachment leads to the end of the executive branch having control of Reconstruction, and now we're seeing the legislative branch, Congress, have control of Reconstruction, okay? Now, the 3 Reconstruction Amendments, okay, we've already talked about 2. You have to know them, okay? The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th granted citizenship, and now the 15th Amendment grants universal male suffrage, okay? Keyword male there. Sorry, ladies, we're not there at the 19th Amendment just yet, but hold on, we will get there. A couple of other terms to be aware of. People that help out in Reconstruction, the people from the North that went down to the South, they're called carpetbaggers. They get their name from the famous suitcase of the day. Scalawags are Southerners that help out in Reconstruction. And the Southerners, this is a derogatory term, scalawags. Southerners were not too happy that other Southerners were helping out, and so they called them scalawags with a negative connotation. Okay, and carpetbaggers, okay, they're the Northerners. They're the ones that either generally want to help out or they're seeking economic gain by going down into the South. Now, Reconstruction starts to really fall apart, okay? There certainly was a lot of progress made with the amendments, with the Civil Rights Bill, the Freedmen's Bureau, but then things start to fall apart. One of the ways in which it starts to fall apart, the establishment of a white supremacist group called the KKK. Now, the KKK, the top of their hate list is African Americans. They're formed right after the Civil War ends, and they obviously are not happy with all these rights being given to African Americans. Now, the Grant administration, which we'll talk more about in the next few weeks, they tried to eradicate the country of the KKK with the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871. Not very successful. They're not able to eradicate the country of them. The KKK is still around today, and so the Force Acts will fail. Now take a look at this, the third bullet there. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was supposed to guarantee equal access to public places. Keep that in mind, okay? The Civil Rights Act of 1875 grants equal access to public places, which means schools and restaurants and water fountains and bathrooms. Everything is supposed to be open to both races. However, okay, you're thinking to yourself, well, I've read stuff, I've watched movies, I've seen TV shows where that's not the case. So what happens? Well, the Supreme Court overturns this in 1883. And when the Supreme Court overturns this, that really shows the end of Reconstruction, and it's all falling apart. And who has the power at the end of Reconstruction? The Supreme Court, because they pretty much deem the Civil Rights Acts are unconstitutional. And so some progress that was made is certainly squashed at the very end. So again, the beginning was the executive, Andrew Johnson and Lincoln. Congress took power after Johnson was impeached, and the Supreme Court at the very end takes over and eradicates the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and things start to fall apart. Okay, President Grant really does nothing to stop this rise of the Jim Crow era. So what is the official end of Reconstruction? This is not in your reading chapter, but this will pop up in the next few weeks in your other chapters. The Compromise of 1877. It's a very simple story, so just stay along with me. So the 1877 Compromise actually is from the election of 1876. The election of 1876, as all elections, it has 2 major candidates, the Republican from Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democrat from New York, Samuel Tilden. Now, you guys know very well by now, how do you win the presidential election? You must win the Electoral College, okay? Problem was, okay, the Electoral College seemed to be in question because 4 states were too close to call. Now, you'd all just lived through an election here in 2020, in which there were a couple of states that were way too close. And what happens is when things are too close, they have to recount them. So they set up the committee that's going to recount the votes in the 4 states. The 4 states that are recounted, the committee is made up of mostly Republicans. So the candidate that winds up winning here is the Republican, Hayes. And the South, who are usually Democrat, they're not too happy about this, okay? They're upset. And so they say, listen, if we're going to allow Hayes to be president, we want a couple of things in return. One, they want a Southerner named to his cabinet. 2, they want more federal funding to help improve the South on Reconstruction. And 3, remove the troops from the South to end Reconstruction. And this restores the balance of power in the South. The Compromise of 1877 is considered the end of Reconstruction, and this is a nice talking point in an essay to say this is the end of the Compromise of 1877. All right, the exam has brought this up before in multiple choice, but again, if you were to write this in an essay, okay, you're really going to wow your reader. The legacy of Reconstruction, you can say it was successful or unsuccessful. You can say it did a lot of things, with the reuniting the Union, the amendments, the Civil Rights Acts, the relationships that were changed between whites and blacks, opens up new political opportunities for people like Hiram Revels, which was in your reading. Or you can say it was unsuccessful, that it only further divided us. And, we have a civil rights movement that occurs in the 1960s. And today we still have social injustice. And, there's so many ways you can go with this. The legacy is totally up to you, however you want to take it. Civil rights ultimately is a long story in its own. However, the first major civil rights legislation of our country come in Reconstruction, so that is a success. But obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done. All right, so just because we have 3 amendments that come from the Civil War doesn't mean the work is ended. Okay, in the beginning of the chapter, there was a quote by Frederick Douglass, and he's basically saying, hey, listen, although slavery is over, it doesn't mean the fight is over for equality. Okay, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. All right, that is it. We are going to end there. That is chapter 15 in the books, and hopefully you found this video to be helpful to your knowledge and understanding of this chapter. If you'd like to, give it a like or subscribe. Other than that, have a wonderful day, my APUSH people.